Welcome to All Grown Up Now, Tales of a Checkered Past. I'm Kenneth D. King, podcasting from my studio near Union Square in New York City. This podcast is an evolution of the tale, All Grown Up Now, A Friendship in 3 Acts. This is Season 2, and it's called Tales of a Checkered Past. It's a collection of short stories from my salad days on up to the present. In each podcast, another self-contained story will be presented. These podcasts will be broadcast bi-weekly, so you get 2 a month. Enjoy. Episode 59 I call Reflections on Choice. A few years ago, in one of my classes at the Fashion Institute of Technology, I had a couple of young lady students who became felons. You may wonder just how that happened. This is the short version. They were from solid middle-class families, not disadvantaged in any way. Being at college didn't mean they were far away from their families. I believe their homes were in New Jersey. And it wasn't like they were in their first year. They were both in their 7th semester, only 1 more semester to go. They got busted selling drugs. Not a little weed, but a big enough amount of whatever they were dealing to land in federal prison. I remember hearing that the federal agents gained their confidence by buying increasing amounts of the stuff, until one night they crossed the line and thrown in jail. The girls got let out on bail. As they left the police station, they started acting like some sort of celebrities when the New York Post went to photograph them and cover the arrest. They even shamelessly mugged it up for the cameras. They seemed to think this was some reality show kind of thing. It was only later they realized they were in deep shit, and they confessed that they sold the stuff to be cool. This is what some would call a poor choice. Some would call it a stupid choice. But it was a choice that will impact them for the rest of their lives. They lost the 7 semesters of school. They may never be able to get a decent job because that question, have you ever been convicted of a felony, will dog them for the rest of their lives. I tell this story to students at FIT because I don't want to repeat. I tell them there are choices that broaden your horizons, and there are choices that narrow them. Choice. The idea that we have choice. The idea that current choices can alter the course of our lives. This is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. Miss Ann had a lawyer named Harry. I've mentioned him before because he was the voice of reason in my adolescence. He was the adult who had the it gets better conversation with me. He also talked about choices and the importance of them, really the cumulative effect of choices. He told me once that there are choices that broaden your horizons and ones that narrow them. Examples of the choices that broaden your horizons include education, travel, avoiding drugs and alcohol, and having some money in savings. Things like drug and alcohol abuse, law breaking, or having a family before you are financially able are examples of choices that narrow your horizons. Though he didn't name names, I understood that Harry encouraged me to observe Miss Ann to learn more. In earlier podcasts, I've told of Miss Ann's first anniversary with her second husband and how it ended with her almost losing her life. He pushed her through a plate glass window in a fancy hotel in Oklahoma City. If not for the draperies, she would have been cut in half lengthwise with the jagged shards of plate glass. It was after this that she decided that divorce was the only alternative. Otherwise, she'd end up dead, and we kids would have ended up God knows where. So, as Harry suggested, I learned about bad choices from observing what Miss Ann did. Here are some bad choices she made that I vowed not to repeat in my life. Bad choice number 1. Long-distance relationships are a recipe for disaster. This is because of the potential for concealing unpleasant things. Miss Ann dated her second husband long distance. Don White lived in Oklahoma City. We lived in Kansas. He would drive up to visit a couple 3 weekends a month, and it was easy for him to be on good behavior. He only had to sustain it for a short time. They were married only after 3 months. Bad choice number 2, marrying in haste. I've heard it said that one should know someone at least 18 months in the same city before considering moving in with them or marrying them. That way, you get to see the person in real life, interacting with and dealing with a complete cycle of a year, and then some. Whenever I see someone who marries or moves in together after only a few weeks, I just cringe. That's because I've seen this story repeatedly over the years. And I don't believe in love at first sight.
Uh-huh.
But Miss Ann marrying Don was the first time I experienced it. Our lives were crazy already. Dad had died at the end of 1968, and Don White arrived in March of 1971. The time between those two events was marked by Miss Ann absorbing the loss of a husband while coping with 3 adolescents. To be fair, it couldn't have been easy for her. Some years after Don White was history, Miss Ann took up with a guy who bilked her out of her college money. Harry had me in his office for another of our talks, and I remember what he said. Lonely people do foolish things, and your mother is a very lonely woman. It applied here as well. That night in March 1971, when Don White called her the first time, must have looked like a light in the darkness for her, a break in the loneliness. We were told of it the next morning over breakfast, that they had dated a few years before Miss Ann had met Dad. Don had still held a torch for her, and this was so romantic that they had been reunited. When she started dating Don, it looked to Miss Ann like she wouldn't have to go it alone. Being a widow woman in Salina, Kansas in the late 1960s wasn't easy. Her women friends regarded her as a threat to their marriages, so she found herself isolated, relegated to hanging out with the older gals who were either divorcees or widows. After 3 months of dating, when Don proposed, she accepted eagerly. Looking back, I realize it was too quick, but at the time, we kids had no choice but to go along. It was only after she married Don and after we moved to Oklahoma that we discovered just who he really was. Nobody can maintain a false facade over time. That summer of 1971 was surreal. Along with Don's alcohol abuse and propensity for wife-beating, Don concealed a drug habit, a tendency towards bestiality, with Brandy, his male toy poodle no less, hints of unwholesome interest in kids — I always kept a watchful eye over Kathy — and small-time hillbilly mafia connections. Don got his drugs by mail — how convenient — from a pharmacy in the Valley View Hospital, a small hospital in some godforsaken hamlet in western Oklahoma. There were times when the packages would be late. Those were the hell-to-pay times, where the rages were more severe because they were complicated by withdrawal. There were a few times that we witnessed these withdrawals, and at first we were told it was a bad case of the flu. but I had never heard of flu making one believe that spiders were crawling all over one's body. Which brings me to bad choice number 3, substance abuse. We didn't call it substance abuse back in the 70s. You were either called a drunk or a druggie. Don was both. I don't know if the drugs he did created the propensity for violence or just fueled it, but violence it was. The two are forever linked in my mind, and I really have no tolerance for either of them. Also, I associate raised voices with violence. If someone starts shouting at me, I'm gone. Heated arguments are not my thing. The drugs, booze, and violence made my life a tornado during that time. I understood the connection between them. Years later, when I was in therapy, my therapist was astonished that I hadn't tried drugs. He asked why, citing the studies that showed that teens in this situation generally either abused drugs or tried suicide. My response was that I understood the drugs and booze were the problem. They caused the chaos and violence. In my mind, they were the problem. Bad choice number 4 is tolerating domestic violence. Having watched domestic violence between Miss Ann and Dawn, I understand that this is more complicated because of the tangled emotions involved. It's easy for people who have never experienced this to just dismissively say, just leave. It's more complicated than that. In my mind, love and hate aren't opposites, but different tangents of one emotion. I think the opposite of love is indifference. That said, for some people, it's easy to make a connection between strong emotion and physical violence. Some people are used to shouting, shoving, and hitting because that's what they saw growing up. If that's what one sees, it can seem normal. The justifications for this behavior can be rationalized out. Oh, he's under stress. He loves me too much. I made him do it. Oh, that's what men do. My daddy hit me and I turned out okay. If you can justify it, you can accept it as normal. What started out as a seemingly one-off thing had a terrible way of creeping into being considered normal. In the case of Dawn and Miss Ann, at first there were apologies and flowers after the abuse, with promises that this wouldn't ever happen again. Then the tension would build until another incident. As I understand it, the cycle of abuse gets shorter the longer one stays. In Miss Ann's case, the honeymoon part of the cycle disappeared, leaving just the violence. And then there was the evening when Miss Ann was pushed through the plate glass window in the fancy hotel in Oklahoma City on her first anniversary. Bad choice number 5. When someone shows you who they are, not believing them and thinking they will change. They don't. In short, X's are X's for a reason. During the year that Miss Ann and Don were married, I wondered just why we were putting up with all this abuse. One night, after another round of drunken wife beating and house destroying, I got my answer. After the logs crashed through the patio doors, Don stormed out of the house, shouting, "Your kids have driven me away. I'm not coming back." The door slammed. I was delighted. Miss Ann looked at us kids standing there huddled together. "You have to help me get him back," she implored. I was the one to ask the sensible question. Why? And that's when we were told about how he had gotten her pregnant when they were dating in the early 50s. Then he ran off to Oklahoma to leave her to deal with having the baby. A single young woman in Salina, Kansas in the early 1950s. It was not a good place to be in that condition, which explained why her family had conniption fits when he arrived on the scene, because they knew the backstory. I marveled that she would even speak to him, let alone marry him after that. But she had believed that he had changed. And he hadn't. As an aside, apropos to the idea of choice, in this whole pro-choice debate, I think back on how different Miss Ann's life might have been if she could have quietly gotten an abortion and gone on with her life. She told us of the hell her family put her through during the pregnancy. Afterwards, she was regarded as damaged goods, and Grandma considered it a miracle that Miss Ann got married to Dad. Mom said that he knew. She wanted to tell him because she was sure if she didn't, somebody would. He regarded that as in her past and none of his business. Every year up until Miss Ann died, Grandma would call her on the baby's birthday to remind her. Every year. So, if she'd had the option of getting an abortion, just how different would her life have been? What damage to her psyche could have been avoided? During that first year they were married, Miss Ann did choose an abortion. It wasn't called that, but for well-off women, they could get a discreet procedure called a D&C. I'm sure she looked at the prospects, 41 years old, 3 kids, teenagers, and her child raising almost done, and an unstable husband who wouldn't be a good father and might bolt for the exit just like he did before. By that time, Don had told her emphatically who he was, and now she believed him. The abortion happened just a month or so before she was pushed through that window. During that horrible marriage, Miss Ann gave to me an experience that I go back to, a touchstone of sorts in my mind. I regard it as the single most important moment in my life. It came around the time that Harry had been talking to me about choices. Now, I've been lucky in my life that the information I need to proceed is put in front of me and in italics so I won't miss it. This was the first time I remember having that experience. It was after one of the many incidents, as we took to calling them. This one involved Don's kicking in a door of an upstairs bedroom for whatever reason. All the doors in that damn house had full-length mirrors on them, as mirrors are usually less expensive than replacing oak veneer doors. I remember that it was sunny. Mom and I were standing there looking at the damage to the door. Then, for a brief moment, the sun was a little brighter, everything was a little more sharply focused, and Mom had a funny look on her face. She turned to me and she said, "You can choose not to live like this." This all happened in an instant. For me, the ground shook. Then, everything was back to normal. Except for me. The idea of choice, and this was a choice, and I could choose not to do this. Life is choices. That idea rocked my mind. It made real the conversations that Harry and I had had. I puzzled about just why Miss Ann chose the situation we were now in, but I couldn't fathom it. But this moment gave me something to hold on to. even though I didn't have a choice right then, one day, when I was a grown-up, I would. And I vowed that I certainly wouldn't choose this kind of life. When I moved out on my own, I chose not to have any chaos or violence in my life. When my trophy husband and I got together, I told him in no uncertain terms that if he ever raised a hand to me, he should either knock me out and be gone before I came to, or he should kill me. If he didn't do either of those, he would live in a world of hurt for a long time to come. Many things I could and did overlook, but violence and chaos were something I did not choose to have in my life. Over the years, I tossed many a man aside because they didn't see it my way. But eventually, I found one who did. And I knew him for 4 years before we married. Dancing with landmines isn't the way to live. It's not a good choice. Thanks for listening. You can get the audiobook All Grown Up Now on iTunes, Audible, and Amazon, or from my website, allgrownupnow.com. You can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spotify, and Google Play. If you have any questions, you can reach me through the website, allgrownupnow.com. You can follow me on Instagram at Kenneth D. King, on Facebook at Kenneth D. King Design, or on my main website, kennethdking.com.